Joni Lamb, one of America's wealthiest and most influential televangelists, was sentenced today to life in prison after a stunning trial that exposed decades of financial fraud and tax evasion. The 66-year-old co-founder of Daystar Television Network showed no emotion when Judge Martin Reynolds handed down the maximum sentence, effectively ending a preaching empire that once spanned continents and reached millions of followers around the world. Rumors surrounding the imprisonment. Colleagues expose shocking details. The rumors surrounding Joni Lamb's imprisonment began circulating long before the public knew the full extent of the situation. It all started with whispers from former colleagues who had worked with her for years at Daystar. Initially, the details were vague, but over time, more and more people began to come forward, revealing shocking stories about what was really happening behind the scenes. Some former employees who had seen the inner workings of her ministry firsthand spoke out about what they described as a culture of secrecy and questionable financial practices. They claimed that the funds meant for religious outreach and humanitarian work were being diverted into personal accounts. The accusations started off small, comments here and there from disgruntled former employees, but soon they snowballed into something much larger. According to these whistleblowers, Joni Lamb had been living a lavish lifestyle funded by donations from her followers. There were reports of extravagant vacations, expensive cars, and even private jets, all funded by money that was supposed to be used for charitable purposes. These former colleagues alleged that Lamb and those around her had been using their position to enrich themselves, all while preaching to their followers about prosperity and faith. As the story gained momentum, more people who had once been close to Lamb and her ministry began to open up. Some described how they had been instructed to falsify financial records, creating fake donation receipts, or inflating expenses to cover up the mismanagement of funds. Others recalled being pressured into staying silent when they questioned the ministry's financial practices. The most damning accusations were from former high-ranking staff members who claimed they had witnessed firsthand how money was misappropriated. "I couldn't stay silent anymore," one former employee said. "When I saw how they were using the ministry to fund their personal lives, I had to speak out. It didn't feel right, and it didn't align with what we were supposed to be doing as a ministry." These revelations from former colleagues painted a picture of a ministry that was far from what it appeared to be on the outside. The public had long seen Joni Lamb as a successful, faith-driven leader, but these accusations were now casting doubt on that image. The more these former colleagues spoke, the clearer it became that the truth behind Daystar was far more complicated and troubling than anyone had imagined. What started as a few whispers of financial mismanagement quickly turned into a full-blown scandal, with authorities taking a hard look at the ministry's finances. The investigation into Lamb's actions would uncover more than just questionable expenses. It revealed a pattern of deceit and manipulation that many had been too afraid to address before. The specific charges against her. The charges against Joni Lamb were severe and far-reaching, and the details of the accusations quickly shocked both her followers and critics alike. As a well-known figure in the world of televangelism, Lamb had built an empire over the years, leading Daystar, one of the largest Christian television networks, while preaching about faith, prosperity, and the rewards of spiritual devotion. However, as the allegations began to mount, the picture that was emerging was one of financial mismanagement, fraud, and abuse of power. At the heart of the charges were accusations of financial fraud. The prosecutors claimed that Lamb had used the donations from her followers, who trusted her and believed in her ministry's mission, for personal gain. Rather than using these funds for charitable causes, missionary work, or humanitarian efforts as the ministry had led people to believe, Lamb had allegedly diverted them to fund her lavish lifestyle. The charges included accusations of misusing millions of dollars in ministry donations to pay for expensive properties, luxury cars, and private travel. It was a shocking betrayal to many who had given generously to the ministry, thinking their contributions were going to help spread the gospel and assist those in need. The specifics of these accusations were laid out over the course of an intense investigation. Former employees and whistleblowers came forward, and the evidence began to paint a disturbing picture of how funds were allegedly funneled into Lamb's personal bank accounts. Bank records revealed that Lamb had spent large amounts of ministry funds on high-end real estate, including multiple properties that were not listed as part of the ministry's assets. These properties were found to be registered under her name and were allegedly used for her personal benefit, not for the religious outreach she had promised. One of the properties, a luxury mansion, was reportedly bought using funds that were raised for humanitarian work and disaster relief. One of the most damaging aspects of the case was the claim that Lamb had personally profited from these donations. The prosecutors accused her of living an extravagant lifestyle while millions of dollars from the ministry were unaccounted for. She was accused of using the ministry's resources to finance not only real estate, but also expensive cars, private jets, and other personal luxuries. This, according to the prosecution, was a gross abuse of trust, as Lamb had publicly claimed that donations would be used for religious purposes. The investigation uncovered even more disturbing details. Prosecutors presented evidence that Lamb had created a network of shell companies to hide the flow of funds and protect her assets from public scrutiny. These companies were located in offshore tax havens, such as the Cayman Islands, Panama, and Liechtenstein. Through these companies, Lamb allegedly moved money across borders, making it difficult for authorities to track the true destination of the funds. This was a clear attempt to conceal the true nature of the financial transactions and evade tax responsibilities. These shell companies were set up under the guise of charitable organizations, but had no legitimate purpose other than to serve as a mechanism to launder money and hide Lamb's personal wealth. Lamb was also accused of falsifying records. The evidence presented by the prosecution suggested that she had knowingly instructed staff members to falsify financial documents to conceal the true nature of the ministry's expenses. This included creating fake mission projects, inflated budgets, and false receipts for donations. The staff was allegedly pressured to go along with this manipulation of records, and those who questioned the practices were reportedly silenced or let go. The defense argued that these actions were part of routine operations within a large ministry, but the prosecution's case suggested that this was a deliberate attempt to cover up what was going on behind the scenes. The tax evasion charges were equally serious. Lamb was accused of underreporting the ministry's income and using fraudulent tax filings to avoid paying millions of dollars in taxes. The investigation revealed that Daystar, under Lamb's leadership, had misclassified funds as charitable contributions, which allowed the ministry to operate tax-free. The evidence presented showed that Lamb had created false documents that claimed funds were being used for outreach efforts, when in fact they were being used for personal purchases. This was seen as an attempt to exploit the tax-exempt status of the ministry for personal gain. One of the key aspects of the prosecution's case was the testimony of former employees who had worked closely with Lamb. These whistleblowers painted a grim picture of a culture of secrecy and intimidation within the ministry. Several former staff members testified that they had been pressured into falsifying records or had witnessed Lamb personally approving questionable financial practices. These individuals spoke about how Lamb's influence and power in the ministry created an atmosphere where staff members felt compelled to keep quiet about what they knew. Some employees claimed they were threatened with termination if they spoke out, while others said they were told that questioning Lamb's decisions was akin to questioning God's will. The prosecution also highlighted the manipulation of donors as a key element of the case. Lamb had long promoted the idea that financial contributions to her ministry were an act of faith that would be rewarded with divine blessings. Many of her followers were encouraged to make substantial donations, often using the promise that their gifts would be multiplied by God. Some donors gave up their life savings, convinced that their generosity would lead to blessings in return. Yet, according to the prosecution, these funds did not go toward the mission of the ministry. Instead, they were used to fund Lamb's personal luxuries, leaving donors feeling deceived and betrayed. Throughout the trial, Lamb's defense team argued that the accusations were an exaggeration, and that any personal expenses were simply the result of the large scope of the ministry's operations. They contended that Lamb's lifestyle was not out of the ordinary for someone leading a successful global ministry. The defense also attempted to argue that the use of ministry funds for travel, real estate, and luxury goods was consistent with the demands of her position as a high-profile leader. However, the evidence presented by the prosecution suggested that this was far from a simple misunderstanding. The extensive documentation and the testimonies from former employees made it clear that these were not isolated incidents, but part of a deliberate and long-running scheme to exploit the ministry's resources for personal gain. As the case unfolded, it became increasingly clear that the charges against Lamb were not just about financial mismanagement, but about the breach of trust that had taken place. She had built her career on the faith and generosity of her followers, and yet, according to the prosecution, she had used that trust to line her own pockets. The charges were a betrayal not only of her ministry, but of the millions of people who had supported her over the years, believing that their donations were making a difference in the world. With the weight of the evidence against her, Lamb faced a grim future. The trial was far from over. But it was clear that the charges were serious, and the consequences could be life-changing. Whether she was convicted or not, her career as a televangelist was already tarnished, and the once respected figure found herself at the center of a scandal that threatened to bring down everything she had built. What she could face. The charges against Joni Lamb were serious and carried potentially devastating consequences for both her personal life and the future of her ministry. As one of the most prominent figures in the world of televangelism, her empire had been built on faith, trust, and the generosity of millions of followers. The case against her, however, threatened to unravel everything she had worked for, casting doubt not only on her actions, but on the integrity of the organization she had led for years. If the charges against her were proven true, Lamb could be facing severe legal consequences. The accusations of financial fraud, tax evasion, and the misappropriation of funds were not minor offenses, and the penalties for such crimes could be life-altering. Under federal law, financial fraud is considered a felony, and the penalties can be harsh, particularly if the fraud involves large sums of money or affects a large number of victims. Given the scale of the alleged fraud, which included millions of dollars in misused donations, Lamb could face years in prison. For financial fraud alone, the penalties could include a sentence of up to 20 years in prison, with additional sentences for other charges like tax evasion or money laundering. Some of the charges against her were federal offenses, and these crimes carry long prison sentences if convicted. The evidence against her seemed overwhelming. Testimonies from whistleblowers, financial records, and internal communications pointed to a systematic pattern of using ministry funds for personal gain. If convicted, Lamb could be sentenced to a lengthy prison term, potentially spending the remainder of her life behind bars. In addition to prison time, Lamb would also face significant financial penalties. The court could order her to pay restitution to the victims, including the followers who had donated large sums of money under the belief that their contributions would go toward charitable and religious causes. While restitution is often difficult to collect in large-scale fraud cases, the court might impose financial penalties as part of the sentencing, which could include a percentage of her assets. If Lamb were to be convicted, it's likely that her properties, vehicles, and other luxury items would be seized and liquidated to repay some of the stolen funds. Perhaps the most damaging aspect of the case was the potential damage to Lamb's legacy. Her reputation as a faith-driven leader who had built Daystar Television Network into one of the largest Christian networks in the world would be irrevocably tarnished. Many of her supporters had trusted her for years, believing that their donations were being used to spread the gospel and help others. To discover that she had allegedly used that money for her personal lifestyle was a betrayal that would be hard to overcome. Even if she was cleared of the charges, it's difficult to imagine her ever fully recovering her reputation. The scandal had already affected her ministry's credibility. Daystar, once one of the most influential Christian networks in the world, found itself under intense scrutiny. The network's viewers were now questioning everything they had been told about how the donations were being used. Could they trust the teachings of Daystar's leaders if they had been complicit in fraudulent activities? The public's trust had been shaken, and the financial backing that Daystar relied on could quickly dwindle. The scandal threatened to bring down not only Lamb personally, but the entire ministry she had worked so hard to build. Lamb's family would also feel the consequences of the charges. Her husband, who had worked alongside her in the ministry, would likely face questions about his role in the organization's finances. While there was no direct evidence that he was involved in the alleged fraud, the public's scrutiny would extend to him as well. Their children, who had grown up in the public eye, would also be affected. They had been raised in a household that was often seen as an example of success in the evangelical world, but now their family was at the center of a scandal. The emotional toll on the Lamb family was already evident, with some reports indicating that they were struggling to cope with the fallout. The once tight-knit family was now facing immense pressure from both the media and their supporters. For Joni Lamb, the immediate legal battle would be only the beginning of the challenges ahead. If she were convicted, she could face a long and difficult time in prison, especially given the nature of the charges against her. The financial penalties could be staggering, and the cost of defending herself in court would likely be astronomical. But beyond the legal and financial consequences, the emotional toll on her and her family would be immense. While Lamb supporters continued to rally behind her, claiming that the charges were part of a larger conspiracy to bring her down, the evidence against her seemed overwhelming. Her defense team would likely fight tooth and nail to clear her name, but it was clear that the odds were stacked against her. The testimony from former employees and whistleblowers, combined with the evidence of financial misconduct, made it increasingly difficult for Lamb to deny the allegations. Even if her legal team could argue that some of the financial discrepancies were due to accounting errors or poor management, the damage had already been done. One of the most significant consequences Lamb could face was the long-lasting impact on the prosperity gospel movement. Lamb had been one of the most vocal proponents of this theology, which teaches that financial blessings and material wealth are signs of divine favor. The movement, which has been widely criticized for its focus on wealth accumulation and the exploitation of followers, would likely face increased scrutiny as a result of Lamb's legal troubles. If the charges against her were proven true, it could lead to a larger investigation into other ministries that promote similar teachings. The ripple effect could be felt across the entire evangelical community, as many other prominent figures could find themselves facing similar accusations of financial mismanagement and exploitation. The consequences for Lamb's career would be far-reaching, not just for her but for the entire evangelical media landscape. Daystar's future, along with the broader influence of prosperity gospel ministries, could be in jeopardy. As more details of the case came to light, it became increasingly clear that the charges against Lamb were part of a larger trend of financial misconduct within the world of televangelism. While it remained to be seen whether Lamb would be convicted or acquitted, the damage to her reputation and her ministry was already done. In the end, Joni Lamb could face years in prison, financial ruin, and the collapse of the empire she had spent decades building. Even if she were to somehow avoid a lengthy prison sentence, the public's perception of her would be forever changed. The once respected figure in the world of televangelism now found herself at the center of a scandal that threatened to destroy everything she had worked for. Her legacy, once based on faith and prosperity, would now be defined by allegations of fraud, deceit, and betrayal. Whether she would be able to rebuild her life or her ministry after this would be something only time would tell. What's next for her career and life? As the trial surrounding Joni Lamb continues, the question on everyone's mind is, what's next for her career and life? The once revered figure in the world of televangelism, known for her role as co-founder of Daystar Television Network, now finds herself at the center of a scandal that has rocked her ministry, her family, and her personal life. For years, Joni Lamb had been seen as a beacon of faith, prosperity, and success. Now, the charges against her have raised questions about the integrity of her ministry and the true nature of the wealth and success she had built over the years. If convicted of the charges she faces, which include financial fraud, tax evasion, and misuse of ministry funds, Joni Lamb could see the collapse of everything she worked for. Daystar, the network she helped create and lead, could be left in shambles. For over a decade, Daystar had been a key player in the world of Christian television, broadcasting religious services, teachings, and inspiring messages to millions of viewers around the globe. But now, with the allegations swirling around Lamb, the network's future is in jeopardy. The potential fallout for Lamb personally is just as dire. She could face a lengthy prison sentence, with some legal experts suggesting that, depending on the outcome of her trial, she could serve many years behind bars. Financially, the cost of defending herself in this high-profile case has already taken a toll. The court hearings, the investigations, and the mounting legal fees are just the beginning of what could be a long, costly road ahead. Even if Lamb were to somehow avoid jail time, the damage to her public image and personal reputation might be irreversible. If she is convicted, Joni Lamb's future in ministry would likely come to an end. Daystar, once a thriving network, would likely have to find new leadership to take over. The trust that millions of viewers once placed in Lamb's leadership would be shattered, and many supporters might walk away, disillusioned by the very person they had once followed and trusted. The reality is, even if she were to return to the ministry after serving any potential sentence, it would be nearly impossible for her to reclaim the same level of influence and power she once had. But what if she were to be acquitted? Would that be enough to restore her career and life to the way it was before the scandal? In some ways, an acquittal might not be enough. The allegations alone have caused lasting damage to her reputation, and even if the legal system clears her name, the public might not be as willing to forgive and forget. Her supporters may continue to stand by her, but many former fans, employees, and followers may feel betrayed by the revelations about her misuse of ministry funds. A clean slate legally might still leave her with the scars of a tarnished reputation, and it could be incredibly difficult to rebuild the trust and respect she once commanded. If Lamb is found not guilty, the next chapter of her life would be about regaining her footing in the world of ministry. But she would face a challenging road. Daystar might continue, but without her at the helm, It would likely never be the same. A new leader would have to step in, and many viewers might feel conflicted about continuing to support the network, given the scandal that had tainted its foundation. Even if Lamb were to regain control of Daystar, she would likely face a new era of skepticism, with some followers questioning whether they could ever fully trust her again. Another challenge for Lamb's future would be the emotional toll the trial and its aftermath have taken on her and her family. The emotional strain of living under the public spotlight while facing such serious charges is immense. Lamb's husband and family would have to cope with the fallout as well, and the public scrutiny of their personal lives would only add to their burdens.